Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page 1256. And we learned yesterday, talking about Gan Eden, which essentially, spiritually speaking, is the place that actually manifests the emotional development that each of us has in microcosm. I would even go on the limb and say that in microcosm, the growth of our emotions is like the Gan Eden within us. Since Gan Eden is a spiritual entity, yes, it's placed in the world of Bria, it channels Atzilus, Gan Eden on its own, and then the Havaya in Gan Eden adds and increases and draws from Chachma and Bina, the Yichud Pnimi, the internal union that draws in turn from Arich and Atik and from the highest levels. So internally, when we are in a state of emotional development, that we are not just purely our reflexive, behavioral, and inherent emotions, mutva, but also murgish, mitzad ha-seichel. In other words, seichel is guiding, chachma and bina are guiding the midas, that is in essence the Gan Eden within us in our Havaya, because Adam Eitz HaSada, a person is like a tree in the field. So in Adam HaElyon, that's Zah of Atzilus. The trees in the field, we learned, are Zah, and also from the word Eitzah, which is Chachma, giving counsel, advice, guidance in how the Hamshach of Yud Kei Vav Kei should take place, as we learned yesterday. So when we are in that level of Havaya, it's essentially like Gan Eden, but the natural Gan Eden, even though I'm calling it Havaya, he did say Havaya doesn't create, but it's still needed somewhat to just manifest, as we learned. Then we're going to learn that real Havaya, B'chol Meidecha, when we really make Gan Eden blossom, would be when our emotions go up to the highest levels and experience that all-consuming love of B'chol Meidecha, which we'll get to soon. So right now we're talking about Atzei Havaya, the divine trees, or the trees that connect with Havaya. And first he explained, based on the Zohar, that's referring to the Gan Eden, the trees in Gan Eden, which is the Shem Havaya, the Gili of Havaya. And then the second half of the paragraph, at the bottom of page 1255, we learned that Eitz is also from the word Eitzah. As I just explained, Eitz is connected to Chachma, but Chitzenis HaChachma, the outer dimension of Chachma, as it speaks to the Midas, like the outer dimension of Bina. And Chachma is called Ayin as well. That's why it says, Hayesh Ba'etz im Ayin, the Eitz, Ayin of Chachma, which is like Bria, Yesh Ma'ayin. Bria Shabbat Silas, because we're talking the outer dimension of Chachma, where there's Kalim. The higher dimension of Chachma is higher than containers, is taka called, as he said, is called Atzilus Shabbat Silas. But Bria Shabbat Silas is Chachma as it comes downward toward the Midas, and that's the Bria. And then the parentheses, he said the same thing with Primius, that also with Primius Bina, and same thing, Primius of the spheres. But we're talking now how they're all being drawn down. We're talking still the natural structure of Ishtalshalos. We're not gone out of the actual structure of Gan Eden, or in this context, Zah of Atzilus and Chachma. It's all within the structure. And then he goes on to say, so if Havaya is Chachma, what's Atzei Havaya? The trees of Havaya, he says that they need an Eitzah, Eich Yeh Hagili D'Shem Havaya. How should this Havaya manifest? How should there be the Tzimtzum of the Yud, the Hey of extension, the Vav of transmission? So it's all about the Hamshacha that goes through the Yud Kei. He only mentions Yud Kei Vav. I explained, I think, why, because we're not talking about Malchus here. We're talking here about Zah. So the Hamshacha of Moichen into Zah. So therefore, how should be the Hamshach? Then the Hey and the Vav. Shazel Seder Havaz V'Amshachas Ha'er Ba'efen Sheyuchel Diskabel. This is all the order and the progression of how to draw down energy in a way that it should be received. And this is all the Oyer, as he says, the Seder Ishtalshlus. Shebezet Tzarech Liyas Eitza, he repeats again, for this you need counsel, guidance, direction. Eichi Amshachas V'Gilei Ha'er. How there should be this transmission of energy. And then he goes back to the first, that before we learn that eitz is just not the interpretation of advice and counsel, but there's also eitz, the simple interpretation. The trees that grow, where he said before that, according to the Ramaz, is Zoyer Ampin. He said clearly, I'm just looking at the Ramaz, who's Zoyer, Nikos Tam B'Shem Havaya. So essentially, in this pasuk, Eitzi Havaya can be interpreted in two ways. Either Havaya referring to Zoh, like the Ramaz interprets on page 1255, that is talking about Zoh. It says, Ilona Dechaya, Eitzi Havaya b'chinas Zoh, Nikli Ilona Dechaya. And Ayin then would be Keser, Im Ayin. Is there a tree or there's Ayin would be Keser? And then there's the second type, Havaya, it goes on Chochmah. Which Chochmah that speaks to Zoh? Moichin, that says the Zoh, Moichin the Zoh. So it's Chochmah that goes into Zoh, and that there, Havaya is Chochmah, and Atze Havaya refers to the Eitza that Chochmah requires the advice and counsel, which in other Maimorim refers to Netzach and Hoid of Chochmah and Bina. He doesn't mention that here, that Netzach and Hoid, that Yeyitzes, Chloyas Yeyitzes, they're like the advisors that channel the Chochmah where it should go. So the summation of it all is they come together. That's why it says, is mi bara Ela, mi is Bina. That bara Ela that gives birth to Ela, which is the 6 times 6, 36 midas of Zah. And that, so Vahainu, and this is the key line, the Bechinas Eitze Havayu, Gile Bechinas Zah, Umoichin de Zah. So Eitze Havaya is both interpretations together. Eitze Havaya refers to Zah, and the Moichin of Zah, Shemebchinas Yichud Chitzeni da Abba ve'Ima, that comes from the outer union of Chochmah and Bina. So, as I pointed out a number of times, Ayin Beis here in these sections is somewhat dense, and things have to be spelled out more. So that's what I'm doing, but it's very much dependent on understanding the pages before. When you understand before what he spoke about at length, he's not repeating the whole understanding of what means Moichin de Zah, but if you recall, it was talking about intellect as it guides emotions. So we're talking now a level that is primarily emotion, that's Gan Eden. However, it's guided by Seichel. This is Gan Eden on its own, as he said at the bottom of page 1254. So if you really want to ground it and really understand it, you have to keep going back and reading what he said before, where he says, but the mortgage is al pi Seichel. So it's Katnusima, and then I was also talking about Chochmah now, but Chetzenis Chochmah. And there, it's not pure raw emotions of a young child that's completely instinctive or reflexive. Here we are talking about a seichel that's guiding the emotions, and that would be the level of Gan Eden. Because remember, Gan Eden is Asaga. He said Gan Eden is Bina, that there's an understanding of Elokus. Remember, Biyud Nivra Elam Haba, so the Yud of Chochmah has now come into Bina in a way that we understand it. Atzmius Habina, that will come after Aveda, that's going to be Lamaila Mahasaga. On page 1255, I'm reading. So I keep referring to earlier pages because the Rebbe Rashab is just giving us the so-called the hyperlink, if you wish, just giving us the connection by saying with the exact words. But if you want to understand it, you have to keep reading back and again. So if you have mastered to some extent the whole idea of Moichin, Chachma, and Bina, like the mother as it relates to the children, and there's also Chachma as it relates to the Midas, because remember there's Chetzenius Chachma, and then there's how Bina and Chachma elevate to be a Yichud Shlim, a Zivuk Shlim, a total union. That is going to be the Gan Eden, that the additional energy we add through our higher levels of Aveda. Right now, we're talking about an Aveda that's still commensurate with the structure that the human being is, and with Gan Eden, and that's the Gan Eden of the natural Gan Eden, so to speak, where there are trees, things are growing, so there are emotions, and they're also being guided, Eitze Havaya, by Chochmah and Bina. but it's still the outer dimension of Chachma and Bina. We haven't gotten to the higher levels. Now, in the next paragraph, the Rebbe Rashab is going to continue this discussion, and you'll see that he's going to connect it to things we learned earlier, but it's going to be very brief. So I'll try to spell out everything, because again, I encourage everyone here to go back and read the last even 10 pages, but if you want even more, go back to 20 or 30 pages. Just, you don't have to read every line, but just to get the flow, because the Rebbe Rashab is heavily leaning on that we already understand what was said till here. And I'm assuming that some questions are going to come up based on, because either you haven't yet completely digested or absorbed that which we said earlier. I'm trying to bring it all together, but that's what he's doing now. Gan Eden is now the place that plays out everything we learned earlier about all the different levels of mutve, murgish, muskel, chitzenius bina, chitzenius meichin, pnimius meichin, gadlus katnus and gadlus bina chachma, all the way to the levels of where we learned about b'chol moedecha, where the midas lift up bina to its core state, and then everything is consumed, because negei benefesh, that highest level where the mind, chachma itself and bina are all part of contemplating how something that's negei to your very existence, your very life. So how seichel and midas come together in those highest levels, which ultimately the highest is the yichud shlim, the total union that gazes at and receives from arich and natik, which really goes all the way up to atzmus ein sof. So if you have that somewhat structured, it'll make a lot easier to understand what we're learning now and what we're going to be learning in the next paragraph. If you don't, I would suggest you go back there or take notes. You could listen to the classes. My suggestion would be is to write down actually the levels as you know them, because you're going to see the Rebbe Rashab is now going to associate in Gan Eden different levels to different ideas, different levels in Gan Eden, or different aspects to what we learned earlier in Gan Eden, in this structure of Midas and Meichin, all the different stages that he discussed. And there are at least, as I mentioned, 1, 2, there's 3 there, and there's 4, 5, 6, 7. I can count probably 8, maybe even 10 levels if you really break it down. Starting from Mutfe Mamish, the newborn, Ibur, and then moving to Yanika, to Murgish, then moving to Seichel, then moving to Seichel, but it's beyond Midas, then moving to deeper level of love and a deeper level of Seichel, and then from Bina to Chachman, from a Yichud that's not complete to a Yichud that is complete. That there are, and I didn't really count them, but I think they're close to 10 levels, not 7 or 8 levels for sure. I'm mentioning it also because the Rebbe Rashab is now going to reintroduce something that and I'm saying this as an introduction to what we're going to be learning. He's going to reintroduce something we learned all the way in the beginning of volume 3. If you may recall, on pages 1208 and 1209, he spoke about the Aliyas HaMalchus, how Malchus rises, and Malchus as in Levana. So there's the Levana as it is diminished and receives from the sun. That's Malchus receiving from Zah, like Biti, like daughter. Then you're going to have Malchus at the equal stature with the sun, where they're both equal, like they were in the beginning of creation, and discusses that itself. And then there's going to be how Malchus goes even higher than the sun, as Mashpia into the sun. So you see already that whole idea of what he spoke about, Ein Oid, that Malchus is ultimately going to be the recipient, is going to become the giver, is now part of the discussion. He's going to reintroduce that. And if you may recall, he spoke about that the Eitz Chaim says that there are 7 levels of the relationship between the moon and the sun and the Aliyas HaMalchus. The Rebbe Rashab spelled out a few of those 7. I'm looking now at page 1208, and he's going to be referring to that as well. So I'm just pointing out how it's critical to really know things that were said earlier to understand what we're going to learn now. But as I'll do my best to guide this through, to serve as the Eitzah, as the guide here, and try to get through it all. So
are you open to questions?
Yeah, you want to ask? Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for the summary. I I guess I don't understand how in the past 20 pages, whatever, a lot of pages going back, he did establish the process of the maturation of the emotions, how the emotions mature from infancy to maturity and mature adulthood, and I do understand how at the greatest level of maturity, there can be an Or Chadash, and the Or Chadash can be, let's say, drawn into Gan Eden, and that's something that you could appreciate. I guess the neshama could appreciate in Gan Eden. It's like a repository, as you said earlier when we started this whole discussion, a repository of merits, if you will, that you accomplished in avoda. But I don't understand how just the structure of maturation, the fact that you go from mutzvah to mortgage to muskul, and from infancy, from et cetera, all the way. I don't understand how that, let's say from take infancy, take mutzvah. What don't you understand?
What don't you understand? What's not clear?
Okay, let me ask you a more simple question. I don't understand how the maturation from mutzvah, let's say, to mortgage, has anything to do with Gan Eden. I mean, Gan Eden, it seems like a higher place where you've done avoda and there's a repository of energy. I don't understand how maturation from the lowest level of maturity, from basically nefesh behema, your instinctual inclinations, even one step beyond that. What does that have to do with Gan Eden?
I wouldn't use nefesh behema here. Everything is nefesh lekis.
Okay.
Just as an aside, but okay. Well, because you're looking at Gan Eden as some type of static state. Gan Eden is a dynamic state. It's constantly growing. The idea of trees in Gan Eden tells you that Gan Eden itself is going through growth all the time. The trees grow. So both on a physical level and a spiritual level, Gan Eden itself is a dynamic. And the truth is, all the worlds are that way. Avoda, when we work, just like in a physical field or garden, when we work the field, the garden will make things blossom more and so on. That's what Adam and Chava was supposed to do. That is the whole purpose of existence. God created a Seder Shtalshlus, and he wants us to make it grow, not just be what it is. Now, there's some growth that happens, so to speak, within the structure. Like, just like, let's call it a regular garden. And then you could turn the garden into a whole new reality, which would really be when Mashiach comes. And that's the meaning of Er Chodesh that comes from higher levels of Avodah. So just think of it that way. That's why I said now in my summary that we really have a Gan Eden within ourselves. Gan Eden is simply an example, of a domain where there's growth. It's a garden, so it has pleasure and so on. It's an example. So we have to move from the example to the moral. The example is a physical garden, but a physical garden also grows. The nimshal is the growth that happens through these different stages. So in a sense, Gan Eden also goes from infancy through, the smaller trees to bigger trees, if you want to put it physically. Spiritually, Gan Eden is really the level of midas and moichin of Elokus. Remember, all the worlds at the end of the day is Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. That's what constitutes the world. So the muscle for that is a tree. It's amazing.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, now you answered my question. Thank you very much. It was very helpful.
Now, but we're still not finished with the topic of Gan Eden, because we still have to talk about the growth. But right now, he's going to continue talking about Gan Eden as God created it, not as humans increase its abundance. So let's keep that in mind. I'm just introducing the next, what we're going to learn inside. So it says V'zehu. So what we just learned, we're talking about Yichud Chitzeni. So we're talking about something that's in place. He did mention from the Pri Etz Chaim that we need avodah to draw it down, but we don't need avodah to create. Like physically, God created the garden without any support or help from the human beings. There were no humans yet. So there is a garden that's also in a state of natural growth. It's like saying the 6 days of the week. Every day, things happen. The sun rises, the moon rises, even before the human being came to it. But it's all within, let's call it the clockwork and the building blocks and the DNA of existence. The human has not yet come and made their contribution, which is, of course, the whole kavanah. God didn't just create a world, so he should have a playground for just to show off. There is going to be a deeper purpose in it all. So, but we're still talking now about the level of Gan Eden. And this is what it says about Gan Eden. Vayita Havaya Elokim. Remember, he keeps coming back to this verse because this verse reveals so much to us. Because till now he said, Vayomer Elokim yehi oyer, Vayomer Elokim yehi rakia. Like on previous page, when it says Vayomer Elokim, he mentions the previous page, but also 12:20 is where. So there you're talking about Milad Yeta. Yeah, Vayomer Elokim yehi oyer. Why doesn't it say Vayomer Havaya Elokim yehi oyer? Vayomer Havaya Elokim yehi rakia. There should be light. There should be a firmament, a heaven, because there the gili is a gili of Elokim. It's a tzimtzum dika gili, the amount of energy necessary for this entity to exist. Gan Eden has an additional gili of Havaya, like Beis Hamikdash. In the existence itself, it's Vayita Havaya Elokim, and that's what he's talking about. Vayita Havaya Elokim. We're talking about Havaya now, either Havaya Zah or Havaya Chochma, as it relates to Zah. Havaya with the Eitze Havaya, which is the trees of Havaya of Chochma. So this is what it says, Vayita Havaya Elokim. So it's more than Elokim, but it's still not the highest levels. It's still Havaya as it's within either Zah or Moichin de Zah, etc. In Avodah, what we spoke about, how Moichin relates to Midas and emotions. Yesh Leimer, and here now the first connection. Let me just preface before we read the next line, the next phrase. Yesh Leimer is going to say like this. Remember, there are three Yechudim that he spoke about on page, when he began the Elias Malchus on page 1249. So he spoke about Ibra Yonika Mechen, if you remember. The three Yechudim. Yichud Havaya Adnai is Biti, the daughter. Yichud Havaya Elokim is Achoisi, the sister, same stature. Malchus elevates to the level of being a sibling with Zah. And Yichud Havaya Eya is Bina Imi, the mother, that where Malchus is higher than Zah. So now he's coming back to that, and he's going to explain that what we just learned about Gan Eden is the level of Achoisi, not Biti, but Achoisi. Because we're talking here how Zah is developing with Moichin of Zah. And both, so that's what he's going to explain now. So he says, Yeshlemer shazer yichud havai Elokim shebegimel yichudim hanal. Yeshlemer, this level vayita havai Elokim that's the yichud. That's why it says in the pasuk vayita havai Elokim. It's the union of havai and Elokim of the three unions that he spoke about. Yichud havaya adnai, lower, biti, daughter. Yichud havaya eya, higher, bina. He's talking here about yichud havaya Elokim, and that's what the pasuk is saying. It's the yichud havaya Elokim. So now he's going to explain what is exactly Yichud Havaya and Elokim, especially in context the Yichud Havaya Adnai. So you may recall when we learned that I explained, and he's going to say it now, Elokim is going to refer to Malchus as it is in Atzilus. And Adnai refers more to Malchus as it already associates with the next world, Bria or Bia. So he says, V'yadua, the Elokim zeo b'chinas ha-Malchus k'meshu b'Atzilus. So Elokim is Malchus as it is in Atzilus. So on its own, it's Malchus on its own. Then Yichud Havaya Elokim is going to be how Malchus connects with Havaya Zah. Yichud Zun. And it's in a state, Malchus, when you say Elokim, Yichud Zah or Malchus. Zun is Zacher in the cave or Zoyer V'nukva. Zoyer Ampin V'nukva. Usually it's Zoyer Ampin V'nukva. Zoyer Ampin refers to, it could also be Zacher in a cave, but it does not mean that here. It's Zoyer Ampin and Nukva, which is another name for Zah. Zah is Zoyer Ampin, Nukva is the female Malchus. So Yichud Kamesha Malchus, Yibchinas Partsu B'Atzilus. Not how Malchus descends as the king that will become the crown and the leader of the next world, but it's how Malchus is looking up and connecting with its spouse, so to speak. So Malchus itself, we've learned at length, has how Malchus descends, like every sphere. We learned earlier, if you remember, every sphere has three dimensions. The dimension as it receives from above, its own identity, and how it gives downwards. So every sphere has like three sides to it. The top of it, the middle of it, and the bottom. In Ruchnis, it means Malchus. Here we're talking about how Malchus is uniting with Zah, and in the Parsuf of Atzilus, Parsuf here means the structure, like the face, the structure of Atzilus, Zun. So we talked a number of times about different ways the spheres are structured. You have 10 spheres. They break down into 3, 3, 3, like Chochmah, Chesed, Netzach, Bina, Gvura, Hoid, Das, Teferes, Yesod, and Malchus. That's one way. Another way is Gimel, Rishenus, and Zayin Tachtenis, the 3 top ones, the 7 lower ones. And then you also have the structures. You have Chochmah and Bina, Yud, Hey, Vav is Zah. The last Hey is Malchus. And then you have where they join. Zah and Malchus join, that becomes another type of entity. Chochmah and Bina join. Whether it's a union, external union, a Yichud Chitzeni or Yichud Primi, depends on the level. So you have many different things happening with these spheres as they interact. Now he's saying, we're talking about how Zah and Malchus is uniting with Zah. It's standing neged across Chagas de Zah. So it's not in the state of Zah being here and Malchus here. Malchus is standing side by side like father, like a husband and wife. Not as Malchus is descending downward. Somewhat similar to when there's Bina as it relates to his children, and then it's not united with Chochmah in the fullest sense of the word. So here we're talking about Malchus standing neged b'chinas Chagas de Zah. Interesting, he says Chagas, the higher 3, not just Netzach Ched Yesod of Zah, but Chagas, the 3 higher levels of Zohar Ampin, the 3 higher emotions. V'hu b'chinas yichud ponim b'ponim. And that is a union that's face to face. Like it says in Eitz Chaim, Shara Zivugim, in the Shara Zivugim, Perek Beis v'Gimel. Beis Vav Gimel is Beis v'Gimel. It's chapters 2 and 3. It's one of the ways it's written. So now, actually, Shara Zivugim is what he brought there himself, this end of chapter 1 on page 1249. As you can see, the Rebbe Rashab is very much here, well versed in Eitz Chaim, and he's been throwing out Eitz Chaims throughout every few sporadically here, but you can see it's all coming together. So let me explain Yichud Ponim B'Ponim to make this clearer. And this is very Kabbalistic. Without explanation, it's just words. So I want to bring it back to a little Chabad, explaining it a bit. So first of all, what's the difference between Ponim B'Ponim and Ocher B'Ocher? Back to back. So Kabbalah says when Adam and Chava were created, we know it says, Nasa Adam b'tzalmenu kidmusenu. Let's create a human being in the divine image. Zachar nekeva bara esam. So he created them male and female. But as most commentaries explain, and Kabbalah for sure, an androgynous creature. It wasn't two entities. It wasn't a man and a woman. It was one man. If you look, du partsufim, Rashi says from Medrash, two faces. There was no back. It's either a male face on one side, like a male face, and if you looked at the back, it was a female face. So basically, they were back to back. Male and female were back to back. Now, what does it mean in Ruchnius? It means that Zohar and Malchus are connected, but they're not face to face, so it's not a full gili. Consider a diminished revelation. That's how the creation was. Then it says God split them into 2. So now you have a full man and a full woman, and now you have the man has a front and a back, and the woman has a front and a back. But when they come together now, Al Kain Yazav Isha's Beis, a person leaves his home to reunite with the female. The male and female unite to reconnect to that original oneness as they were in the divine image, which is what a sacred marriage is. They come together face to face, not back to back. Back to back would be like an insult. The 2 people talking to each other back to back is not considered exactly pleasant. That's when you don't like someone. That's what you do. You talk to them, but back to back. It's like, it's almost a one of the comedies out there. When people don't get along, that's what they do. Either they don't speak all together, but if they do, they speak back to back. I mean, I'm saying it somewhat a little tongue in cheek, but that's the idea. Face to face is a union. You see each other, the love, the embrace. And I'm not just talking about the physical face-to-face. It just signifies a full relationship where I'm embracing you, you're embracing me. What does it mean in Ruchnius? A yichud panim b'panim is like we read in Chumash. What is it? Who does it say yichud panim b'panim? Panim b'panim dibur Hashem or panim el panim? It says it by Moshe Rabbeinu that God spoke to him face to face. Or it says by the Eden that God spoke to them face to face. However you explain it, the point is it was a pnimiusdika connection. When you speak to someone in their face and to a person you really love, that's a deep level of affection and connection. So yichud panim b'panim in Ruchnius means when two levels are very deeply connecting with each other. Yichud acher ba'acher means there's still a yichud, but it's far more external one. So what he's saying here is that when Malchus, Havaya Elokim, Zah and Malchus is when Malchus is in Atzilus, uniting with Zun, with Zah, making it Zun, and it stands neged b'chinas chagas, meaning a cross, and that's the yichud. He calls yichud panim b'panim as the Eitz Chaim there in Shara Zivugim. And interesting, what does Shara Zivugim mean? It's the gate of union. Zivug is the name for a union, an intimate union. It's another name for marriage, another name for intimacy. Zivug. Zivug is like binding together. So in that, there he talks about this idea of yichud panim b'panim. So we see from this, it's higher than Malchus as it's in a lower level, but it's still, we're going to see, is not the highest level. It's still, they're now equal. Malchus and Zah are equal. It's like the middle level, the sister or the sibling. So I know we're talking husband and wife and sibling, and it all sounds confusing, but the sibling part is just to demonstrate that it's not a daughter, it's on an equal stature. The Zun as husband and wife is obviously the same idea, where they are uniting one on one. Another thing should be pointed out in Kabbalah, Chassidus talks about why Yaakov married sisters, that because in Ruchnius, actually the union of sibling is considered a very high level. When it comes down below, it's total incest, which is literally Gilui Arayis of the worst possible sins. So this whole Maimarim Chassidus that talks about why something is so sinful down below and above is considered to be a big thing. The union of achesi and all of that. So this Maimarim, if you want to look that up, in Derech Mitzvah he talks about it in the mitzvah of Gilui Arayis, the Alter Rebbe. It's fascinating stuff. It's really an aside. In case somebody had that question, it is discussed and not relevant to our conversation because we are talking obviously in holy state here, not in, God forbid, anything that is negative or prohibited. Okay. One of the reasons, by the way, that Kabbalah was always studied with great care, as the Baal Shem Tov said, lahafshit hanyanim megashmiyusam, because when you read it literally in Eitz Chaim or in Zohar for that matter, you can, if you don't understand subtlety, and no one qualifies that this, we're talking about spiritually very high spiritual levels, it can be misinterpreted, and it was misinterpreted. You know, when people like Shapsei Tzvi, especially the Frankisten, the Jacob Frank, they literally took ideas from Kabbalah and they turned it into orgies. I'm not exaggerating, in the worst possible way, literally incestuous relationships, because they said, now's the time to bring down those levels down here. Now, of course, what's missing, besides halacha, is they're missing the understanding of Kabbalah the way it's supposed to be understood. It's not about indulging in sexual hedonism. It's about very high levels of unions. But it was always studied with care because it could be misinterpreted if someone is not primed properly to understand we're talking about subtleties here, and not just subtlety, you're talking about ruchnisdika levels that should not be confused with gashmis. It's not because it says yichud zun above doesn't mean you can just come down to earth and start connecting with every male and female. There are laws and rules and how it's done in a sacred way, because like all powerful forces, sexuality can be lift us to the greatest heights, but can also bring us down to the lowest depths. So just as an aside, obviously it's not being qualified here because the Rebbe Rashab is assuming we know that, and we're learning it after these introductions. But I'm just saying it in case anyone's learning this or hears it now or later, just to qualify, make sure this is clear. Okay, so these few lines, complete Kabbalistic words, no explanation, just connecting things. So what we're talking in simple, let's call it simple psychology, if you wish, or English, would be that when we're saying Malchus and Zoh is emotions. It's the emotions that are mashpia into Malchus. Malchus in this case would be like the makabel, the recipient. So if you talk about a student and teacher, the teacher is higher than the student. But then the student grows, and as he grows, he comes closer to the stature of the teacher, to the point we say that at 40 years old, or 40 years from when he learned, the student can come to the level of the teacher. That's called the growth. In the context of relationships, you can have a situation where makabel, like Levana, is receiving from the son, but then there's a point where the Levana becomes equal to the son. In the context of husband and wife, you could have a situation where one is dominant over the other, and then they stand as equals, ponim b'ponim. So this can be applied in many different ways. In the context of what we're learning here, Malchus, if you remember, he referred to as bringing everything down into action. But when you bring something down into action, let's say a mitzvah, if action without mides can just be mechanical, Kabbalah sale. So we do need to bring it down. You can't just go up to the highest levels, like he made it clear with B'chol Moedecha, then you have to bring it down. So Malchus was bringing it down, as he said on page, just looking up where that was, I think it was page 1248, as well as top of 1247. Okay, but so Malchus can be somewhat separate from the Midas. Yes, you told me now, you paskind, Midas told me what the halacha is, now I do it. Or Malchus could be saturated and elevated that it is feeling the kavana of Ava V'yira, of Chesed and Gvura. So Malchus, in a sense, is like almost Zoh in its closest infancy. It's minimal amount of real defined and deliberate emotions. It's like almost the action, behavioral part of the emotions. Malchus receives from that. But as a person grows, you want the actions not just to be behavioral, you want them to be filled with some feeling. You have love of God, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, where I'm up to now in chapter 4. He talks that you really want to fulfill a mitzvah. Someone who fulfills it truly is when you do it out of love. You're not just doing it mechanically, robotically. So midas, elevating to emotions, means, so to speak, that the actions, which Malchus will become the action that will then create Bria and so on, is elevated to the level of Zoh, and they're standing face to face in this Yichud Pnimi that he described. Now, this is still not connecting to Moichin. Moichin is the next level, where the Moichin comes in there. But we do remember when Yichud Havaya and Elokim, Malchus receives from Chochmah and Bina just as Zoh does. When Malchus is the daughter, its Moichin comes through Zoh. When Malchus is equal to Zoh, meaning like Yichud Zun, like we're talking, Havaya Elokim, then Malchus is receiving directly also from Moichin, as we learned on page, where was that? That was on page, I believe, page 1250. Also 1249, 1250. So again, I'm bringing that back here. So now, in the, you know what? I see it's time. And I don't want to do the parentheses quickly, because you see the parentheses is going to go back to the levels, the 7 levels of the union of Malchus and Zoh and Levana and Shemesh. So I'm going to stop here before the parentheses, before the Ayin Mashakosov. Any questions?
Yeah, just to elaborate on what Yitzhak asked earlier, Rabbi Jacobson, about Gan Eden and its relationship to us. This level of Gan Eden is accessible for a Rasha V'Tovlo. I mean, it's not just for Beinanim, it's for all of us, or whatever it is. I mean,
a few right classes now, back,
in our time now, right now, as we live, not just
a few classes back. I think Yitzchak also asked a similar question. The answer is there is no such thing as a person who has not done a mitzvah in their lifetime. As soon as there's one mitzvah in your life, you already have Gan Eden to some extent, because the mitzvah generates divine energy, and that energy is stored somewhere. Now, most people have more than one mitzvah. So yes, the answer is in one word, yes. Everybody has a Gan Eden. Even if a person has many sins, doesn't erase, remember, sin does not erase a mitzvah. It just means they have to deal with that. So even a person who may have to go through Gehenna, in other words, to heal and recover from the scars that the sins created, that doesn't mean there's no Gan Eden that was a result of their mitzvahs. So it's just a matter of stages of when and what. And then there's also different levels. Remember, there's infinite amount of levels of Gan Eden. Gan Eden is not like a birthday cake, and once you cut it up, there's nothing left. It basically, Gan Eden is a spiritual entity that everybody, every good deed, every action is so-called stored there in a way, like we said, a repository. And it's there right now. Now, the more you prepare yourself, the more you are acclimated, the more you'll appreciate it. Now, I think the Kotzker Rebbe once said that the difference between Gan Eden and Gehenna, between heaven and hell, is Gan Eden, Gehenna, hell is Gan Eden for those that don't know they're in Gan Eden. In other words, you could end up in Gan Eden if you don't appreciate. Like, take a person who's never learned anything and suddenly ends up in a base medrash or in a kollel. For them, it'll be like hell because they don't know what to do. It's like a place, a very boring type of place. But the point being is, that's just an aside. The point is, yes, Gan Eden is the schar for mitzvahs. But remember, there's also a Gan Eden, like he's talking about here, that's there even before there's avodah in the full sense of the word. So that's the short answer is that, yes, there is Gan Eden. Now, when we say Kol Yisrael Yesh Lam Chelik Le'Lam Haba, usually that refers to Tchias HaMesim. That even those that for whatever reason, their Gan Eden is limited, or they couldn't end up in Gan Eden, everyone's going to have Tchias HaMesim. But that also needs to be explained because it also says chutz, except these and these. Actually, that reminds me, I have to post an article that I asked my office to post. I'll post it as soon as I can, about this topic, about what about all the neshamas that seem to, they say, they're cut off or punished, or is there such a thing as a neshama that will not ultimately be redeemed and connected? So that's a general picture of it. And remember, neshamas, it's my final point, a neshama, despite what happens on this earth, a neshama never loses its chelik elikam emal mamish. It cannot lose its divine identity. It could be concealed. It could be severely concealed. It could be to the point of total golus, and the only way for the neshama to be revealed is in another body, because that person has so toxified their lives. That's possible. But the neshama never gets destroyed. You can't destroy a chelik elikam emal mamish, just like you can't destroy elakah. You can't destroy the chelik elakah. That's why it's afal pisha chata Yisrael who. So that needs to be discussed. What happens to us? Now, of course, we have to also qualify Teneka Shenishbu as opposed to a Rosh of a Raloi or even a Rosh of a Tovloi. A Tenek Shenishbu is a whole other category. It's a neshama that came to this world and was never given opportunity. You have to ask the question, why would God do that? But that's another discussion. But there is that element. And the Rebbe paskins very clearly that most Jews today, especially in that world of the unaffiliated or the grew up ignorant, are Tenek Shenishbu, which is a whole different category, that all this doesn't even apply to them in a way. Because you can't punish someone for something they didn't know. And it's not even inus. It's not even shegig. It's completely Tenek Shenishbu. And there, you could say Gan Eden comes from simply maybe the good deed that they did, or whatever Hashem sent them here for, to finish maybe certain Aveda that wasn't finished, and whatever journey they have to go through. But that's another discussion, which I don't want to go into now, how different neshamas, what they experience in these higher levels. Also, remember, all neshamas are cumulative. We don't come in a vacuum. You and I have parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, all the way to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. So when the Rebbe told George Rohr or others, there's no such thing as beginners, a beginner's minion. That wasn't just a nice, cute statement or euphemism. The Rebbe was saying there's no such thing as a beginner, because every neshama, every Jew on earth has generations of generations that stand behind you, like a nonas al gab anok, like a midget on the shoulders of giants. So when you take that into account, you can imagine it's far more complex than just black and white. You did something wrong, or you did something right. There's a whole accumulative energy. How much energy accumulated just from the amount of mitzvahs? Eliezer, you're not an actuary, but calculate all the mitzvahs and all the mesiras nefesh and the kiddush Hashems and from the beginning of time, start from Avram Avinu till this day, you find quite a number. And that is, where is it all? So Chassidus uses the example of munach b'kufsa. It's like placed in a chest, in a treasure chest, like Gan Eden. So that energy is somewhere. And when we say Mashiach is about to come, we're just saying the energy is accumulated. It's about to erupt, like right pre a volcano, right? A moment before the volcano erupts. It's unbelievable amount of energy there, or a tsunami, or an earthquake, or whatever you want to compare it to. I mean, a positive way, obviously. So when you take all that in account, you can imagine it's the big picture here.
But the question I'm asking though is, who's they put it away?
Your voice is drowning out. It's hard to hear you. Eliezer, can you hear me? Your voice is drowning out. The reception doesn't sound. Is he there?
He just turned his mic off, then back on. Your Wi-Fi connection is very bad, Eliezer.
I don't know. It's on my cell phone again. Okay, but I guess
now we hear you.
My point here is that this energy that was put in the kufsa, or it's in Gan Eden repository, as we've been referring to it, is that like an 401k or an IRA that you can't get to it until you later, after you pass away, or
it's more like a 501c3.
That's a good one. That was good. So that means that I guess if you're involved with nonprofit religious work, you can access Gan Eden. Because I guess after all the difficulties of raising money for these 501c3s, you deserve Gan Eden.
I didn't know that 501c3s had any cash in the bank.
No, but it has a lot of mitzvahs. But
for sure,
that's really my question.
They have these. What do they call them? They have these. What do they? They put away money. I forgot what it's called. Not trust. A
CD, certificate of deposit.
No. Like Harvard has a $20 billion
endowment.
Endowment. Okay, so go back to your question. Is it like a 401? Look, let's put it this way. The truth is, now that I think about it, Ayin Beis actually asked these questions. If you go back to page, no, really, he did. He literally asked these questions. If you go back to page, 1 second. Yeah. Let me just give you the right page. 1 second. Parentheses, yeah. You go back to page 1211 and 1212. He actually asked these questions that are not been answered yet. He asked the question about schar mitzvah. On one hand, it says schar mitzvah b'hai al maleka, that in this world there's no reward. It's only in Gan Eden. Then he said, what do you mean? It says, telechu, that's mitzvah tishmeru, you'll have in the sati gishmechem. The Torah is filled with rewards in this world. You'll honor your parents in order to live long. You'll live long. So he did not answer this question completely. He didn't even say that how is it possible that through a physical mitzvah, we generate spiritual energy when they're two different realms. And he said clearly, you can't just say the kavana. So the truth is the full topic is not really has not been really explained yet by the Rebbe Rashab. I will just say this. One thing is assured. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, yichud zeh, when a person does a mitzvah, the yichud zeh that you create from the mitzvah, the yichud, is nitzchi la'olam v'od, l'mayla. That means there's no such thing as a good deed that remains unrewarded. Just not possible. Because the good deed lives on forever. The energy it generated will never disappear. The question is, do you merit to see it in this world? Or do you only merit to see it in the next world? Or both, or to some extent. And we know there's different stories where they say that that's the literal, not the Tanya's interpretation. What means tzaddik v'raloi means that in this world, it's not easy for him in order that he should have a better, the next world. It's not the Alter Rebbe's type, it's the Gemara's type. But the point I'm making here is that this needs to be discussed in detail. When you do a mitzvah, what happens? You can be blessed in this world, and you see people who do a lot of mitzvahs, and they are rewarded. You see they're rewarded with children and with nachas and with wealth. And then you see the exact opposite. People full of mitzvahs, and they live a very difficult life. So all this is part of the conversation. Then you see the opposite. People who don't live such a beautiful, a kind life, and then they live very beautifully, and others suffer. So what you're touching upon is all of that, and I think that's what you're touching upon. The bottom line is every good deed will, at some point, as I said, immediately or later, it has an energy. And Gan Eden ultimately is the place where that energy is stored. Now, you can also have a taste of Gan Eden in this world. Elam chatir b'chayecha is an expression that you shall see your world, you shall see it in your lifetime. It's a blessing given to people that you should see some of that reward here in this world. And some don't see it, or not completely. So which part do you want to, you see, you're talking about all of this?
Yeah, great. No, I got it. That was good. I appreciate that. That energy. I think
I do want to make one point just to make sure it's understood. Remember, a mitzvah lives on forever. A sin does not, because it's negative energy. Negative energy is not permanent. It could be erased. In other words, that's why we have tshuva, or in time. That was one of the main reasons. What's one of the big explanations the Rebbe said? You can't keep arguing that maybe there'll be another Holocaust, Rahman al-Islam, because Jews have sinned. Because at some point, punishments erase sins; they don't erase mitzvahs, and reward doesn't erase mitzvahs. So mitzvahs keep accumulating. Sins kept on being wiped out through every golus we went through, and that's the whole point of golus and Yisurim, and the oppression and the afflictions and the Holocaust and everything. So you can't say in the famous sikha from the Rebbe Vayechi and Shmois Tavshinun Aleph, he says you can't keep saying, oh, because more people did sins, so then that accumulates and another, God forbid, tragedy. Because no, sins are erased. The Holocaust erased plenty after what we went through. It was not a small matter, like the Rebbe speaks in that sikha. It was a colossal genocide. It wasn't a few people. So that's just part of the whole bigger discussion. But we're going a little off. It's not really, it's relevant to that pages that I mentioned, and we will get back to it. The Rebbe Rashab, I know, gets back to it in relatively at length later. So we're going to get a picture of reward and punishment, or cause and effect is what I like to call it. You know what? We'll stop here before the parentheses. That's all been recorded. Ayin Beis.